Why is there no visible proof of God? I believe this is a valid question that atheists bring up. If God was real and if he loved us, why wouldn't he make his presence known? The fact that he hides shows either God doesn't exist or he doesn't love us enough to make himself known to prevent us from going to hell. However, the more I studied this question from a biblical perspective, the more I realized that there is no visible proof of God because he loves us. The fact that God doesn't make himself known empirically shows how much he truly loves us. You should know Jesus already answered this question in the Bible when he gave the parable of the rich man in hell. The rich man asked Abraham to send Lazarus back to warn his brothers of the terrible place he was in. Yet Abraham denied the rich man's request and told him, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." Now at first glance, this doesn't make sense. Why would Abraham deny the rich man's request? Surely if any of us saw a ghost from beyond the grave who had come back to warn us of the dangers of hell, we would certainly be convinced that God exists and we should submit to him. But what Jesus is saying in this parable is it's not a matter of knowing that God and hell exist. It's a matter of how you feel about God. Let's just say there was visible proof of God. Let's say he sat on his throne in a palace somewhere in the Middle East, and you could go and see he exists and worship him there. Every human would believe in him and accept that he was God, and no one would go to hell, right? Actually, I think the opposite would happen. Everybody would go to hell. Here's the point. If God was a tangible being on the planet, with all his power and glory, you would worship him and be obedient to his laws because you'd be afraid of him and be afraid of being sent to hell for being disobedient. You would only be good because you'd be afraid that God might punish you. Your entire motivation for being good would not be because you love God or were thankful for what he did for you on the cross. You would be good because you would be worried about yourself. In other words, you wouldn't be good for goodness' sake or for God's sake. You would be good for your own sake. And that's the problem, because that's the mindset that sends people to hell. When you're only thinking of yourself and only worried about taking care of yourself, you become filled with self-absorption. Fear only makes you think of yourself, and thinking of yourself is what sends you to hell. See, when Jesus came into this world, he taught that salvation meant the opposite. He taught that his salvation was only for people who didn't put themselves first. In Matthew 10:39 he said, "He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." Then in Matthew 25, he gave the parable of the talents, which is a story of servants. 2 go out and serve their king with the money the king gives them. And the third becomes filled with fear and buries the money the king gives him because he's afraid of what the king might do to him. And because the servant is only thinking of himself, he hides the money for his own safety. Thus the king disposes of him, because the servant was self-absorbed. Maybe not in the usual way we think of self-absorption, but nonetheless, he was still self-absorbed. See, in the parable of the rich man in hell, what Abraham is saying back to the rich man is, fear will never work. Sending Lazarus back to warn his brothers of the dangers of hell will only create fear, and fear doesn't get you to stop focusing on yourself. It only makes you think of yourself even more. And if God was a visible being on the planet, you would be utterly filled with fear. You wouldn't change from thinking of yourself to thinking of a relationship with God, or start loving God and loving your fellow man. You would only be thinking of yourself and how to avoid hell. So your actions would change, but your heart wouldn't. It would still be self-absorbed, just in a different way, but still self-absorbed. What changes your heart is learning what God did for you on the cross, knowing the most radical act of love that ever happened, which is when God went willingly to the cross to take our place, even though we didn't deserve it. And where you find that is in reading about Moses and the prophets. When you learn about that and accept it as truth, then your heart begins to change, and you see that even though you deserve hell, God took it upon himself. When you know the love of God, that is when your heart begins to change. Many people have a misconception about the path to heaven. They think it's just living a good life and following all the rules. So if God was real, he should make his presence known, so I'll know that heaven and hell exist and I can follow all of God's commandments. But when people do that, the heart doesn't change. You're still self-absorbed, because your attitude becomes, I'm doing good, I'm working hard, so God has to bless me. And you're only thinking of yourself. You are using your moral deeds to force God to bless you. The only way to change the heart is through a radical transformation of love, and we see that love when we read about Jesus and what he did on the cross. If God was a powerful king on the planet, you wouldn't see the love he gave for you there. All you would see is this mighty king, and you would never know the love he has for you or what he really wanted for you. You would just be filled with fear and self-absorption. Many people have a misconception that God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden because he didn't want to be with them anymore, which is not true. Jesus had Adam and Eve leave the garden because he saw they had become self-absorbed, and they were only thinking of themselves. And in such a state, if they were to stay with God, they would only try to please him and form a relationship with him to see what they could get out of it. Their entire attitude would be, I want to please you, God, not because I love you, but because I love myself and want to be blessed. So because of their new sinful attitude, God had no choice but to make them leave his presence. Not because he didn't want to be with them, but because he knew what the relationship would be with them. And he could not look upon such a relationship. Instead, we needed to see the action of how much he truly loved us before we could begin to escape our self-absorption. Now, in the relationship we have with him, he gives us everything, and in return he asks that we give him everything back. Not because he's selfish, but because he was utterly selfless. He came into our world in weakness and willingly died for you, because he loves you more than you can imagine, and he doesn't want to be in a relationship where you fear him for your own life's sake. He loves you, and he wants you to love him back. So knowing the true nature of your heart and the mindset you would have if he was here visibly, he instead reveals himself in ways that won't assure your damnation,